The struggle for Irish independence has taken many forms across the centuries of British occupation. One figure, John O'Mahony, has been part of that struggle for many years, and his efforts have been through many means. Despite losing control of a movement he nurtured for years, his actions paved the way for an unusual route for emancipation of his people. For many years after being conquered by England, the Irish had been treated as a client state, with its own parliament that was subordinate to the British king and his cabinet. However, the English continuously undermined the Irish in their religious, ethnic, and economic freedoms through legal discrimination, which impoverished the land and its people, unless they adopted English ways of life. Clearly, these efforts by the British government to anglicize the Irish did not go over well on the Emerald Isle, and a hatred towards England was nurtured, which led to countless secret societies and rebellions opposed to the British crown. Because the French and American revolutions inspired many Irishmen to yearn for their own self-governance, and England feared a French invasion on the British Isles through a more sympathetic Ireland, towards the end of the 16th century, Ireland was severely cracked down upon. These efforts only made those English fears more justified, as many more Irish were pushed to join rebellious societies, the most important of which at the time was the Society of United Irishmen, who began plotting with revolutionary France. After a French invasion force was damaged and turned around by a storm, the British decided to aggressively repress Irishmen, where many revolutionary leaders were found and arrested. Out of fear of losing support for their movement in the wake of British violence, the United Irishmen were forced into a premature rebellion, which was brutally crushed. In the aftermath, the Act for Union of Great Britain and Ireland was passed, that dissolved the Irish Parliament, but once again, this only perpetuated the problem they feared by further entrenching Irish hate towards their rulers. John O'Mahony was an educated Irishman who was inspired to resist English rule over Ireland by his father and uncle, who had participated in the aforementioned United Ireland Rebellion, and by a movement to repeal the Act of Union. It helped that the area of Ireland in which he resided was a stronghold for Irish culture and language at the time. Gaelic was even his first language. Enthralled by Gaelic oral traditions in his early years, O'Mahony went about amassing many songs and poems, which is noted by a renowned revolutionary, Charles Joseph Kickham. Young as he was, John O'Mahony earned the reputation of ranking among the foremost Gaelic scholars of his time. His nationalism was further entrenched by his higher education at Trinity College, where he studied Gaelic, Celtic, and pre-colonial Irish history. Soon, O'Mahony would be studying the writings of revolutionaries and forming connections with his contemporaries, hoping to inspire the peasantry of Ireland to fight for their emancipation and a democracy. Eventually, through his political interactions, O'Mahony was courted towards the Young Ireland movement, which supported a separation from Britain, not only through independence, but in regaining a common Irish heritage. While not officially becoming a member of Young Ireland, he was friends with some of their leaders, notably James Fintan Lalor, who was a proponent of militancy in the movement. Increasingly, leaders of the Young Ireland movement supported an armed rebellion and slowly began amassing arms. Irishmen in America even began forming a militia and gathering funds to support this Irish revolt. But before the group was fully prepared to revolt, British Parliament presented a bill that would suspend habeas corpus in Ireland, meaning that they could arrest anyone without cause and for an indefinite period of time. This forced the Young Irish into a hasty rebellion, before enough of them could be unjustly imprisoned that it would snuff out the movement. Until this point, O'Mahony had not publicly aligned with any specific party, as he first and foremost wanted an independent Ireland, and thought that the various parties did not promote unity in that endeavor. But he was spurred into action as many arrests began to unfold in his area, and O'Mahony took the mantle of a military leader, motivating many to join together and prepare for a fight. When the Young Irish began to organize their forces, they appealed to O'Mahony, and here is where he officially joined their cause. But ill-prepared, under poor management, and unable to field sufficient numbers, the movement was easily destroyed after a lackluster attempt to fight off police. Attempting to learn from the mistakes of this revolt, and remaining popular in his region, John O'Mahony, using the increasingly devastating potato famine and a warrant for his arrest as provoking factors, rebelled again. This time, the more organized group conducted efficient guerrilla warfare against British forces sent to capture O'Mahony, as they used their knowledge of the local terrain to evade arrest. When he finally began more offensive maneuvers, the rebels were much less successful, as the partisans lacked discipline and training, which eventually forced O'Mahony to disband his peasant militia. With the reward for his capture now raised to £100, and many of his allies and family arrested, John O'Mahony himself fled to France alongside other Irish rebels. His revolutionary zeal followed in his flight, and was bolstered by the fact that Paris was a hub for revolutionary refugees at the time. He stayed in France with one James Stephens, another Irish rebel that had arrived just before O'Mani. Together, they joined the local Irish Parisian Association to try and continue helping their countrymen from abroad. They took this time to gather information from other underground societies on the making of a revolution, formed contacts with locals and other expatriates, and hoped to make allies for an independent Ireland. After taking part in the unsuccessful defense of the French Republic from a monarchist coup d'etat, these men lost hope that France would be the ally that they so hoped for, and they reconsidered their strategy. While supportive of the French and their right to a democracy, O'Mani now went to New York, where many Irish revolutionaries had also fled, and where a robust population of Irishmen resided. Upon arriving in New York, O'Mani found that the population was not much better off than back at home, albeit much more urban. As many of the Irish immigrants arrived without many skills to thrive in an industrialized setting, frequently they were forced into the worst-paying jobs. With the rate of Irish immigration being so high at the time, alongside the rampant poverty in the community, extreme racism was felt towards the Irish. So, rather than adopting a new American-Irish identity, Irish immigrants maintained a strong Irish nationalism. This worked to benefit O'Mani, as what resulted were insular and interconnected communities of Irish people longing for their homeland and ready to sacrifice for an independent Irish state. Many had military experience from the various wars of American expansion, and so, local Irish military organizations were created. One of these groups of trained Irishmen were even incorporated into the New York State militia. At this time, these Irishmen could form these military organizations because, while not openly enemies, the USA and Britain had competing interests in expansion. Recently, their numbers had been bolstered by those who had fled Ireland after the several latest uprisings, but they lacked a uniting organization or figure to follow, so infighting and factionalism was common. Especially as a famous Irish revolutionary figure, John Mitchell, had arrived in New York, and Britain became increasingly entangled in the Crimean War just before O'Mani arrived, there was a buzz among American Irish about another attempt at independence. Mitchell had begun the Irishmen's Civil and Military Republican Union, in hopes that within a couple of years, he could organize a military force with significant financial support to aid an uprising in Ireland. This was a clear place for O'Mani to begin his American endeavors, with many flocking to Mitchell as a figure of hope. But to the frustration of O'Mani, after the leader began infighting with another popular figure in the community, and Russia showed no interest in supporting Ireland, Mitchell abandoned his movement. So, partnering with Michael Doheny, he created the Emmet Monument Association, named after Robert Emmet, a famous Irish rebel. And in hoping to avoid the friction with other groups that plagued the organizations, this militant society, in the words of one of its members, focused on preparation, therefore, was the rule of our exertions and our hope. We resolved to aim and discipline all our countrymen who were ready for any hazard. No more speeches, no more resolutions, no more threats, no more boasts, no more failing, no more appeals for beggars' sympathy, but silent, steady, sedulous work, with our teeth clenched and our hearts steeled until events presented themselves that we could turn to account. And soon, the association spread to different cities, and within New York, 3,000 Irishmen would be members of this militia. Now with a more established footing, relations with Russia significantly progressed, but once the Treaty of Paris was signed that put an end to the Crimean War, a native Irish uprising was no longer feasible. The Emmet Monument Association was disbanded, but left a small council that could restart similar efforts if another opportunity arose, and O'Mani retreated from political life for the first time in many years. Tensions rose between France and Britain after the Crimean War, as it was discovered that France planned an alliance with Russia after the armistice, and British intelligence misinterpreted that the French were planning an invasion of the Isles. At the same time, in India there was a major uprising against the British colonial rulers that took another significant portion of British attention. O'Mani had been in a political torpor since another of his attempts at Irish emancipation failed, but these new developments reignited his spark, and he got to work with the council left by the Emmet Monument Association. This group would come to be known as the Fenian Britherhood, and O'Mani, being a prominent figure in the Irish community, was voted its president. The name Fenian Brotherhood comes from the bands of semi-mythological elite warriors called Na Fianna, who would protect the High Kings of Ireland. By this time, communication was re-established with James Stephens, who had returned to Ireland from France to inspire more revolutionaries. In these communications, Stevens agreed to create a parallel secret society in Ireland so that the two groups could support each other's efforts. Although, the Fenians had a very sluggish start, with funding extremely lacking due to an American economic crisis that struck the Irish community hard, resistance from Catholic clergy, and when Stevens visited America, he created a deepening wedge with other revolutionary leaders due to personal disagreements. Especially compared to other actors in Irish-American politics, O'Mahony's sincerity to the cause of Irish liberation clearly extended beyond furthering personal popularity and fame, which allowed the Fenians not to collapse in its early years. Slowly, the Brotherhood would spread to many cities throughout America, even reaching San Francisco, and the San Franciscan branch of the Brotherhood took on the organization of the funeral of Terence Bellew McManus. In many ways, McManus was revered by the Irish, as after he partook in an Irish rebellion, abandoning his successful company, he was exiled to Tasmania. After he escaped, he lived the rest of his life in poverty, and many Irish could see themselves in his suffering and sacrifice. There would be funerary processions in San Francisco, New York, and finally, the Fenians transported McManus's body to Ireland, where he would be laid to rest in Dublin. Tens of thousands would attend these processions, and it gave the Fenians the spotlight they needed, as many began to flock to the organization afterwards. Another boon came to the organization with the outbreak of the American Civil War, as despite many not being able to fulfill their duties for the Brotherhood when they joined the Union Army, they did gain valuable military experience. Various Fenian leaders would join the Union Army, support the formation of Irish regiments within the army, and spread Fenian ideas during this war. It also helped shift American opinion of the group, since the British aided Confederate ships to get by the Union blockade of the South with trade goods, souring American-British relations. Unfortunately, there was a falling out between Stevens and O'Mahony, and this rift in their relationship was so great that the American branch of the Fenians separated from the Irish branch, while remaining parallel and friendly organizations. A small group within the Fenians opposed O'Mahony's policy of preparation until a moment to strike presented itself, and liked the way Stevens demanded action. These so-called men of action invited Stevens to America, where he went around to the various branches of the Fenians and armies of the Union, supposedly on a mission to gain support for the movement, although in reality, seemingly out of spite for no longer sending aid to Ireland, Stevens touted the slogan "War or Dissolution" in 1865 to create opposition to O'Mahony as he recruited. This push to take action within a year captured the hearts of many Irishmen, and opposition to O'Mahony now grew from a vocal minority of the Brotherhood to a threatening faction. Stevens also created a new governing body in the Fenians called the Deputy Head Center, through which O'Mahony's influence was undermined, and they even tried to send money to Stevens' organization. Overall, the plan was to remove O'Mahony from the Brotherhood through the muddling of the structure of the organization and stacking the Central Council of the Fenians with men of action, despite O'Mahony's remaining popularity in the organization. Henry William Roberts and John O'Neill became leading figures of opposing views within the Fenian Brotherhood, and of the fading democratic practices in the organization towards oligarchy. O'Mahony knew that this faction was propelling the Fenian Brotherhood headlong into self-destruction, but he found hope in the degradation of American and English diplomacy now that the Civil War was concluded and a war between the nations loomed. Not wanting the past decade of his life devoted to the Fenians to be in vain, O'Mahony restarted relations with Stevens, and several Fenian officers were sent to aid the organization of another Irish uprising. As the course of revolution developed in Ireland, some of the Fenian opposition factions saw the prospects that both the American rivalry with Britain and weakness of British North America provided. So, soon the Fenians discussed an invasion of Canada. In a meeting of the Brotherhood, a plan was assembled by Roberts and his faction, which stated that, in tandem with an Irish uprising, an invasion of Canada would be organized as a bargaining tool to trade for Ireland's freedom. If the British refused the trade, the territories south of the St. Lawrence River would be ceded to the United States, which would bring the USA into a war with Britain. An invasion of Canada was already on the minds of American politicians and their manifest destiny. So, when delegations of the Fenians approached them with their plan, they simply replied, the government of the United States of America would, in such a contingency, acknowledge accomplished facts. But what happened instead is that Roberts began funneling all efforts solely into a Canadian invasion, rather than continuing to aid their Irish counterparts, despite the fact that their plan involved an Irish uprising. O'Mahony objected to these efforts, as a divided attack at home and in the colonies would split the limited power that the Fenians had in comparison to the British Army. Despite losing the support of Stevens himself after learning of the invasion, Roberts continued to support their plan, and the internal division that ensued caused no aid to be sent to Ireland for a time. The ensuing weakness of the Irish branch led to its infiltration by British spies, and once again, led to the government revoking habeas corpus in Ireland to squash the threat. Hundreds of militarily experienced men, revolutionary leaders, and revolutionaries were arrested, and to top it off, the American government lost their confidence in the effectiveness of the Fenians as a result. Nonetheless, the opposing faction continued their preparations, and hoped to regain the support of the USA by invading the disputed island of Campobello off the coast of Maine. If he did not begin to work alongside this aggressive faction, O'Mahony feared the splintering of the Fenians, and so betted on the fact that the plan was small-scale enough that it could be successful, and that in victory, the Fenians could find a new wave of support. A group of men arrived in Eastport to conduct the attack, although their plans were thwarted, since the British had found out about the attack, and in a show of force, moved several warships to the island. The Neutrality Act of the United States also provided a basis for the dispersal of the Fenian troops by the United States government before the invasion could get off the ground. This was disastrous for the reputation of the Fenians, and after one more attempt to calm the brash Roberts-O'Neill faction failed, O'Mahony finally resigned from his leadership position, seeing that there was no point to him being there. With resistance negligible at this point, the Fenians began to formalize their invasion plans. 3 armies would attack from 3 different directions along the American-Canadian border. This 3-axis attack would come from Chicago, Buffalo, and Vermont, hoping to spread the defenses of Canada thin and focusing on cutting off supply to Canadian forces with the limited infrastructure of the colonies. The embarrassing attempt at Campobello and the resignation of O'Mahony, who was the face of the Fenians among the common members, meant that very few rallied to this cause. It also didn't make sense to many Irishmen that they would secure their own independence at the expense of another nation that was under British colonial rule. Another devastating blow would hit the Fenians' morale when Stevens, who had been able to gain some American support, began an Irish uprising that was swiftly overcome. As always, the preparations were not as secretive as they should have been. So, the Canadians knew that something was coming, and had thousands of militia mustered. The only thing was that they didn't know exactly where the attacks would come from. This meant that Canadian forces were spread thin across the entire border. The Colonel John O'Neill headed the attack from Buffalo across the Niagara River, where his plans were to capture Fort Erie, and his army, of around 800, called themselves the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA. These men landed at Ridgeway, and were faced with an outnumbering force. Fortunately, these Canadians of the Queen's Own Rifles had little to no military experience, in contrast to the Fenians, many of whom fought in the American Civil War. There was a serious delay in reinforcement for the Queen's Own, so the 900 men were told to advance on the Fenians before they could establish a solid foothold. This inexperienced Canadian force marched into an ambush of battle-hardened Irishmen, causing a swift rout of the colonial troops after the Fenians charged. Meanwhile, another group of Canadians had landed behind the Fenians, but they expected the main Fenian army to have been defeated, so they were unexpectedly outnumbered and routed. By this time, on the other side of the Niagara River, the American army had arrived, blocking any further reinforcements of their position and cutting off vital supply. O'Neill was forced to acknowledge his untenable position and chose to surrender to the US. They would be treated better by the Americans than the British, the latter of which had several thousand men now advancing on their positions. And so, in their retreat from Ridgeway, the Americans arrested these Fenians for breaking the Neutrality Act. The Fenians in Chicago never attacked, as they didn't get anywhere near the numbers that they expected, and so, only hearing of their friend's victory in Canada, began to move to support this effort. Similarly, many men stationed in Vermont did the same, but en route, both parties were stopped by the US and detained. 200 men were left south of Montreal, and in the wake of these arrests, they were ordered to attack in one last-ditch effort to continue the Fenian goal. Thinking that there were several thousand Fenians on the move, and hearing of the humiliating Canadian defeat at Ridgeway, several thousand Canadian militiamen retreated. Pigeon Hill was where the Irish made their defensive positions, but when they found out that around 5,000 Canadian troops were now advancing on them, this group retreated to America, where they too would be taken into custody. The Fenians that participated in these raids saw limited repercussions by the American government when detained, which allowed for them to return to their local communities as heroes rather than criminals. O'Neill was one of the Fenians arrested, but charges were dropped, and because his offensive was the only one that saw some success, he was seen as a hero by many in the movement. Quickly, O'Neill was appointed the Inspector General of the Irish Republican Army, and eventually was named the Fenian president for his popularity. On the other hand, this invasion provided impetus for the creation of the Dominion of Canada, which, before this, was a divided group of colonies known together as British North America. The invasion showed that a united Canada could offer sufficient protection for the colonies that, alone, were weak. Despite the armies of the Fenians being dispersed, O'Neill began planning another Canadian invasion soon after, in spite of the limited support of both the members and administration of the organization. O'Neill focused, for the next period of time, on recouping forces that were lost to the British, dispersed by the American government, and had abandoned the movement after such humiliation. But the movement was thoroughly infiltrated by British spies, and once again, over 10,000 Canadians were mustered to defend the Dominion of Canada in hearing of another planned invasion. A few hundred Fenians mustered in Franklin, Vermont, and marched north into Quebec. This time, though, the Fenians barely made it across the border before they were fired upon by a local volunteer force known as the Home Guard, or Red Sashes, and some militiamen. This volunteer force had connections in Vermont and used them as spies, which allowed for advanced warning and preparation. During the firefight, one group of Fenians flanked the Canadian forces with an artillery piece to allow the other Fenians pinned under Canadian fire to move. All the while, from a vantage point across the river, O'Neill was commanding the forces, only to be arrested mid-battle by an American officer. Slowly, the Fenians would be forced to retreat, leaving behind their artillery. But a Fenian, Samuel Spear, was not so dejected, and regrouped the Fenians in Malone, New York, and from here, they attacked into Quebec. Holbrook's Corners would be the site of another minor skirmish, but the dispirited Fenians facing a larger enemy were easily repulsed. This raid did nothing but improve the morale of the Canadians, who saw these battles with a nationalistic sense of pride and made them local heroes. William Bernard O'Donoghue was an Irishman who had previous contact with the Fenians in America, and had watched several Irish rebellions rise and fall, which forged a disgust for the British. His life had taken him to the Red River Colony in Manitoba, where his hatred for his colonizers brought him to partner with Louis Riel, a rebellious Métis man who strongly opposed British prejudice against Métis and Native Americans. Louis Riel began a rebellion against the British, and O'Donoghue was an influential figure at his side, until the two men fractured their relationship, with O'Donoghue thinking that bloodshed was necessary for success. The Métis leader of the rebellion preferred a more diplomatic route, using force when necessary and wanting to avoid the death of his people. Either way, the two were forced to flee into the US together in the face of overwhelming odds and went separate ways. In his exile in America, O'Donoghue returned to the Fenian cause and asked O'Neill to support an invasion of Manitoba. The Council of the Fenians rejected sending men to his cause, but supported the man's endeavors with munitions. O'Neill and some others saw an opportunity to regain Fenian glory and mustered a handful of troops in Minnesota to aid O'Donoghue. As a protective measure, those that participated in this attack resigned from the Fenian movement, and the Fenians publicly renounced the plan. Hoping to be able to rally some Métis and Louis Riel to the fight, this meager force of about 35 men marched from St. Paul. They planned to establish a provisional government run by Fenians, and with O'Donoghue as its president. In the meantime, Louis Riel had returned to the Red River Colony, and to show the Canadian government he was no longer a threat, he gathered some Métis cavalry to defend against the raid. This didn't matter though, as the troop of men captured a Hudson's Bay outpost that was not even on Canadian soil. Due to the lack of a solid border, they thought they were in Canada. Even then, a Canadian spy in the ranks of this small force went and informed a colonel at the nearby Pembina fort, and this colonel moved out and arrested these men. This was the last hurrah of the Fenians, and their dreams of a Canadian invasion fizzled out, never to see the light of day again. And that was the Fenians highlighted. Please like and subscribe if you liked the video, and if you have any suggestions or comments, leave them in the comment section below, or email me with my email in the description. I also started a Patreon if anyone is interested in supporting a small creator like myself.